My husband drained our accounts to spend $44,000 on a VIP trip to a soccer final in Paris. He did this without saying a single word to me. But the money was not the worst part of his betrayal. The worst part was that he left for the airport and locked our 4-year-old son inside a freezing dark house all by himself. When I rushed home early from a business trip and heard my little boy sobbing behind locked doors begging for his dad to come back, I realized the man I married was a monster. My name is Natalie. I am 33 years old. What I walked into that freezing Thursday night shattered my reality and set off a chain of events that ended with my husband in handcuffs. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. If you have ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your life, hit the like button and subscribe. You will want to hear exactly how I made him pay. I was supposed to be in Denver until Friday afternoon for a national accounting conference. But a strange, heavy feeling had been gnawing at my chest all day. Call it a mother instinct or just pure anxiety, but I could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong at home. I skipped the final networking dinner, paid the exorbitant fee to change my flight, and boarded a plane back to Chicago a full day early. I did not call my husband Greg to tell him I was coming. I just wanted to get home, see my son Leo, and sleep in my own bed. The taxi dropped me off at the end of our driveway just past 9 in the evening. The November wind in Chicago was brutal, cutting right through my thin business blazer. I dragged my suitcase up the walkway shivering and immediately noticed that the house was pitch black. Not a single porch light was on. Greg always left the driveway lights on when I was traveling. I frowned, assuming they were simply exhausted and already asleep. I pulled my keys from my purse and reached for the front door. But before the key even touched the metal lock, I heard it. A high-pitched, raw, agonizing wail coming from inside the living room. It was Leo. He was screaming. Not the kind of cry you hear when a child drops a toy or scrapes a knee. This was the absolute unrestrained terror of a little boy who was completely alone in the dark. My heart slammed against my ribs. I shoved the key into the deadbolt and twisted, but the door would not budge. Greg had thrown the internal security latch from the inside. I pounded my fists against the heavy oak door, screaming Greg's name. I yelled for him to wake up to open the door, asking what was wrong with Leo. There was no answer. Only the continuous heartbreaking sound of my 4-year-old, sobbing, his voice hoarse as if he had been crying for hours. Panic, pure and blinding, flooded my veins. I dropped my suitcase on the porch and sprinted around to the side of the house. The motion sensor floodlights flicked on, casting harsh shadows across the frozen grass. I hammered my palms against the side windows, peering into the dark dining room. Nothing. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and dialed Greg's number. It rang once and went straight to voicemail. I dialed again. Voicemail. The screams from inside were growing more frantic. I could hear Leo choking on his own tears, crying out for someone to help him. I could not wait for the police. I could not stand out in the yard for another 10 minutes while my baby was terrified inside. I ran to the back patio and grabbed a heavy ceramic flower pot sitting empty near the grill. I wrapped my thick suit jacket tightly around my right arm, took a deep breath, and swung the heavy pot directly into the center of the kitchen window. The glass exploded inward with a deafening crash. Shards rained down onto the kitchen tile. I did not care about the jagged edges remaining in the frame. I reached my covered arm through the broken pane, found the latch, and forced the window open. I hoisted myself up and tumbled headfirst into the kitchen, scraping my ribs and tearing my blouse on the glass. I scrambled to my feet in the darkness, my breathing ragged. The house was freezing. I blindly hit the light switch on the wall, but nothing happened. Someone had flipped the main electrical breaker for the living area. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing the beam toward the living room. The sight made my stomach heave. The room was completely trashed. Cushions were torn off, the couch drawers were pulled out of the console table, and empty takeout boxes were scattered across the rug. And there, huddled in the corner by the cold fireplace, was Leo. He was wearing his thin summer pajamas, shivering violently, his face stained with tears and dirt. When the flashlight beam hit him, he threw his arms over his head and let out a terrified scream. I dropped my phone, rushed across the room, and fell to my knees, pulling his tiny, freezing body into my chest. I held him as tightly as I could, rocking him back and forth on the ruined floor, whispering that Mommy was here, that everything was going to be all right. As I sat there in the dark, staring at the empty space near the hallway, where Greg's luxury travel suitcase normally sat, a sickening realization washed over me. Greg had not been attacked. He had not been kidnapped. He had packed his bags, walked out the door, and left our baby behind. I barely had time to process the magnitude of Greg's betrayal before the flashing red and blue lights painted the living room walls. The sharp glare sliced through the darkness, illuminating the dust floating in the freezing air. Heavy footsteps pounded up the front walkway, followed immediately by a fist hammering violently against the front door. "Police, open up. We have the house surrounded. Step away from the child and show your hands." The neighbor must have heard the glass shattering and called emergency services, reporting a break-in. My heart, already beating at a dangerous pace, kicked into a frantic overdrive. "I am the homeowner," I screamed back, my voice raw and cracking. "My baby is in here. Please do not shoot." The heavy oak door rattled as they tested the knob, and when it did not yield, I heard the distinct sound of a tactical boot kicking the wood. On the second kick, the door frame splintered and the deadbolt gave way with a sickening crack. 3 officers stormed into the entryway, their flashlights blinding me. The beams crossed over the trashed living room, the broken glass in the kitchen, and finally rested on me, kneeling on the floor, clutching my sobbing 4-year-old. "Put the child down and raise your hands right now," the lead officer commanded. His hand was resting heavily on his holstered weapon. I tightened my grip on Leo, who was screaming harder now, burying his face into my neck. "I cannot let him go," I cried out, keeping my hands visible but refusing to release my son. "He is terrified. I am his mother. I live here. I just got home from the airport and had to break the window to get inside because my husband left him locked in the dark." "Ma'am, slowly stand up and step away from the boy," a second officer repeated, ignoring my explanation entirely. I realized exactly how I looked to them. My business suit was torn, my arm was bleeding from climbing through the broken window, and I was sitting in the middle of what looked like an active crime scene. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the panic down. I am an accountant. I deal with high-stress audits and federal regulations. I know how to de-escalate a hostile room. "My name is Natalie," I said, my tone suddenly dropping to a calm, steady register. "This is my house. My purse is sitting on the front porch right where I dropped it. My driver's license is inside, matching this exact address. My suitcase is next to it with a luggage tag bearing my name and a flight itinerary showing I landed at the airport less than 2 hours ago. I am the victim here. Please go check my bag." The lead officer stared at me for a long second, the tension thick in the cold air. He nodded to the youngest cop who stepped out onto the porch. A moment later, he returned holding my black leather tote and my suitcase. He handed my wallet to the lead officer, who shined his flashlight on my identification card, then looked back at me. The aggressive posture of the police instantly vanished. The lead officer holstered his weapon and let out a heavy sigh, gesturing for the others to lower their flashlights. "Okay, Natalie," he said, his voice softening slightly. "We got a call about a burglary in progress. Can you tell me exactly what happened here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could explain the nightmare, I had just walked into another figure stepped through the broken front door. It was a woman in a heavy winter coat, a badge clipped to her lapel. Child Protective Services. The police must have dispatched them immediately when the neighbor reported hearing a screaming child during a suspected break-in. The caseworker did not look at me with sympathy. She looked around the freezing room with clinical, calculating eyes. She noted the shattered kitchen window, the freezing temperature, the overturned furniture, and the fast food wrappers scattered across the rug. Then she looked at Leo, who was still shaking violently in his thin pajamas. "This environment is completely unsafe for a child," the worker stated, pulling a notepad from her pocket. "The temperature in here is freezing, there is broken glass on the floor, and the child appears neglected. I am going to have to take him into emergency protective custody. The words hit me harder than the cold wind. You are not taking my son, I said, standing up and pulling Leo securely against my hip. I just told the officers I was out of town for a business trip. I came home a day early because I had a bad feeling. My husband was supposed to be watching him. The worker raised an eyebrow, her pen pausing over the paper. And where is your husband now? I do not know, I admitted, the humiliation burning my throat. But I just got here. I am a fit mother. I have a stable job. I have no criminal record. And I will take him to a hotel right now if I have to. You have my flight records. You know I was not the one who left him. Flight records do not change the fact that this child was abandoned in a hazardous environment, she replied coldly. If you cannot prove to me right now that you have a safe plan and that you are not complicit in this neglect state, law requires me to remove him from the premises for his own protection. She was entirely serious. I was standing in my own ruined living room fighting to keep the state from taking my child because the man I loved had decided to vanish. I needed proof. I needed to show them exactly what happened. I scanned the dark room, my eyes landing on the small black dome mounted in the corner of the ceiling. The security camera. Greg had pulled the main breaker to disable the lights and the internet connection, thinking it would cover his tracks. But as a financial auditor, I know there is always a backup system. Officer, I said, my voice steadying into the clinical, authoritative tone I used during hostile corporate financial audits. The main breaker is off, which killed the wireless internet router. But that specific security camera model records continuously to a local micro-memory card as a fail-safe. If you let me get a step stool from the kitchen, I can pull the card and show you exactly who left my son in this freezing house. The lead officer exchanged a long, hard glance with the Child Protective Services caseworker. He gave a sharp nod. Go ahead, he instructed, keeping his hand near his belt. Move slowly. I handed Leo to the female officer, who immediately wrapped him in a thick thermal blanket she had retrieved from her patrol cruiser. I walked into the dark kitchen, my shoes crunching loudly over the broken glass from the window I had smashed minutes earlier. I found the small folding step stool, carried it into the living room, and positioned it directly under the camera dome. My hands were shaking from the adrenaline and the cold, but I forced my fingers to remain steady as I twisted the plastic housing. I located the tiny slot on the side and pressed the memory card until it popped out into my palm. I stepped down and retrieved my laptop from my leather work tote resting on the porch. Sitting cross-legged on the ruined living room rug, I slid the memory card into the side port and flipped open the screen. The glaring white light of the monitor illuminated the faces of the 3 police officers and the caseworker, who had all formed a tight, silent circle behind my shoulders. My battery was at 40%. It was more than enough. I opened the file directory, sorted the encrypted video files by the most recent date, and clicked on the timestamp from 1 o'clock that afternoon. The video player buffered for an agonizing second before the high-definition color footage filled the screen. There was no audio, but we did not need sound to understand the absolute horror unfolding in our living room. The timestamp read 1:15 in the afternoon. The living room was clean. Sunlight was streaming through the front windows. Greg walked into the frame. He was wearing a tailored suit jacket, a crisp white shirt, and his expensive Italian leather shoes. He was dragging a massive hard-shell luxury suitcase behind him, his phone pressed to his ear. A moment later, Leo ran into the frame. My heart shattered all over again, watching my baby boy on the screen. Leo was holding his small stuffed bear, looking up at his father with a confused, worried expression. Greg did not kneel down to hug him. He did not kiss his forehead or explain that he was leaving. Instead, Greg pulled his phone away from his ear, rapidly typed a text message, and shoved the device back into his pocket with a look of intense annoyance. He grabbed the handle of the heavy suitcase and started pulling it toward the front door. Leo realized what was happening. On the screen, my tiny 4-year-old dropped his bear and lunged forward, wrapping his arms tightly around Greg's right leg. You could see Leo's little face contorting into a desperate wail. Greg stopped. He looked down at his own son, his expression completely devoid of empathy or warmth. Then, with a harsh, violent motion, Greg reached down, grabbed Leo's arms, and physically peeled my sobbing child off his leg. He shoved Leo backwards so hard that the boy stumbled and fell onto the rug. Greg did not even pause to see if Leo was hurt. He turned his back, opened the front door, and stepped out onto the porch. Leo scrambled to his feet and ran toward the door, reaching out for his father. But Greg pulled the heavy oak door shut right in his face. A second later, the internal deadbolt visibly clicked into place, locked from the outside with a key. Greg had deliberately trapped him. The video ended. The living room was dead silent, except for the sound of my actual son softly whimpering in the female officer's arms. I closed the laptop. I did not cry. A cold, absolute rage had completely replaced my fear. I looked up at the Child Protective Services worker. Her clinical detachment was completely gone. Her face was pale and her jaw was clenched tight. She looked at the lead officer and gave a single definitive nod. The lead officer immediately grabbed the radio clipped to his tactical vest. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. We need to upgrade the situation at this address immediately. I need an urgent trace on a suspect, white male, 35 years old, last seen leaving the residence at 1300 hours. Suspect is wanted for felony child endangerment and criminal abandonment. Put an alert out to all transit hubs and the airport." He let go of the radio and looked down at me. His eyes filled with a grim, apologetic respect. "Ma'am, no one is taking your son tonight. You are not a suspect anymore. Your husband is. And when we find him, he is going straight to a holding cell." The lead officer immediately began barking orders into his radio, coordinating the search with the airport police and local transit authorities. The female officer who was holding Leo gently asked if there was any family nearby who might know exactly where my husband went. I wiped a streak of dirt and dried tears from my cheek and stood up from the cold floor. My eyes scanned the wreckage of the living room, searching for any clue. That was when I saw it. Pushed halfway under a pile of tossed mail on the entryway console table was Greg's silver iPad. He had left it behind. I walked over and picked up the cold metal device. The screen illuminated, demanding a 6-digit passcode. Greg always thought he was a master of digital security, but I knew the man better than he knew himself. I typed in our wedding anniversary. Incorrect. I typed in Leo's birthday. Incorrect. I scoffed, realizing I was giving him way too much credit for caring about his family. I typed in the date his favorite college football team won the national championship. The screen unlocked instantly. The officers were busy photographing the broken door and the trashed room, leaving me alone with the device for a brief moment. I tapped directly into his email application. Right at the top of his inbox was a folder recently created and meticulously labeled Paris. I opened it and my stomach plummeted as the digital receipts populated the screen. As a certified public accountant, my brain automatically processes numbers faster than words. The bold figures on the electronic invoices jumped out at me like physical blows. The first receipt was from an international airline. 2 round-trip first-class tickets to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. $12,000. The second receipt was for a 5-star luxury suite at a historic hotel near the Eiffel Tower, booked for 6 nights. $15,000. The final receipt was from an exclusive sports concierge service. VIP sideline access and hospitality passes for the European Soccer Champions League final. $17,000. I stood frozen in this drafty hallway doing the mental math. $44,000. My husband, a mid-level sales manager, who constantly complained about the cost of Leo's preschool tuition, had just dropped $44,000 on a vanity vacation. We did not have that kind of money sitting in our joint checking account. We barely had $10,000 in our emergency savings. The realization that he had not only abandoned our child, but financially destroyed us in the process, made my vision blur with an intense, blinding rage. "Ma'am," the lead detective called out, stepping over a fallen lamp and pulling me from my thoughts. "Did he leave any notes? Do you know if he contacted anyone before he took off?" I did not answer immediately. I closed the email application and opened his text messages. I needed to see exactly who he had been talking to. At the very top of his recent conversations was a thread with Brenda, his mother. The timestamps were from yesterday afternoon, right around the time the security camera captured him walking out the front door. I tapped the thread and began to read the exchange. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Greg had texted her. My flight leaves at 4. Natalie does not get back until Friday night. Go over and check on Leo when you have time. I left him with some snacks and the TV on. Do not call Natalie, she will ruin this trip for me. I felt the blood drain completely from my face as I read his mother's reply sent just 3 minutes later. Have a wonderful time in Europe, sweetheart. You have been working so hard and you deserve a break. I will swing by the house tomorrow morning to check on the boy. Love you. Tomorrow morning. It was currently Thursday night. Brenda had known since Wednesday afternoon that her 4-year-old grandson was sitting alone in a house. She had agreed to cover for her son, promised to come by, and then she had simply never shown up. She let my baby sit in the dark, freezing hungry and terrified for over 30 hours, just so her golden boy could go watch a soccer game in France. I walked slowly back into the living room. My hands were no longer shaking. My tears were completely gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I held the iPad out to the detective. The glowing screen illuminated his rugged face as he took it from my hands. He did not leave a note, I said, my voice dangerously calm. But he left a digital trail. He is in Paris. He spent $44,000 to get there. And you might want to send a squad car to my mother-in-law's house, because she knew he left my son here to die and she did absolutely nothing to stop it. The detective read the text messages on the screen. His jaw tightened instantly. He handed the iPad to another officer to bag as evidence. He looked at me, and for the first time that night, there was a flash of genuine fury in the cop's eyes. Do not worry about the mother-in-law, he said quietly. We will be paying Brenda a visit very soon. The sun rose over Chicago like a block of ice. I had not slept a single minute. After the police and the Child Protective Services caseworker finally left around 2 in the morning, I dragged a mattress from the guest room into the hallway, away from the draft of the shattered kitchen window. I taped a thick piece of cardboard over the broken glass to keep the freezing wind out. Leo slept curled against my chest, his small hands gripping my shirt tightly, even in his sleep. Every time he shifted, my heart ached with a mixture of profound relief and boiling anger. At exactly 7:15 in the morning, a violent pounding on the front door echoed through the silent house. The heavy strikes rattled the wood, making Leo whimper in his sleep. I gently untangled myself from him, pulled a thick cardigan over my ruined blouse from yesterday, and walked toward the entryway. Through the frosted side glass, I could see a familiar, imposing figure standing on the porch. It was Brenda. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Before I could even speak, my mother-in-law shoved her way inside her heavy designer winter coat, brushing roughly against my shoulder. She did not ask how Leo was. She did not ask if I was okay. Her eyes darted around the messy living room, landing on the cardboard taped over the kitchen window, and her face twisted into a mask of pure disgust. Are you completely out of your mind? She hissed, turning on me with eyes full of venom. The police showed up at my house at 2 o'clock in the morning. 2 in the morning, Natalie. They pounded on my door and treated me like a common criminal, asking me questions about my own son and grandson. And now I come here and see you have smashed your own windows like a lunatic. What kind of hysterical stunt are you pulling? I stared at her, genuinely stunned by her audacity. For a brief second, I thought maybe she truly did not understand the gravity of what had happened, but then I remembered the text messages. I remembered her promising to check on the boy she never intended to visit. Stunt. I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerously low register. You are calling this a stunt. Your son left his 4-year-old child locked in a freezing house to fly to Paris. You knew he left him here. You texted Greg and told him to have a wonderful time, and you promised to come check on Leo. You left a toddler alone in the dark for over 30 hours, Brenda. He could have starved. He could have frozen. He could have died. Brenda did not even flinch. She crossed her arms over her chest, lifting her chin in a gesture of absolute defiance. Oh, please spare me the dramatic accounting. Greg works incredibly hard to provide for this family, and he needed a break. He has been under massive stress. If you were actually a supportive wife, instead of always choosing your precious corporate job over your family, he would not have needed to escape to Europe to find some peace. My blood ran cold. She was actually blaming me. She was using my career, the career that paid for this very house, to justify her son abandoning our child. You left Leo with some dry cereal and the television on. She continued, smoothly waving a dismissive hand. He was perfectly safe. You are the one who panicked and called the cops to ruin Greg's reputation. Now this house is a disaster area. There is broken glass everywhere and it is freezing in here. This is an unfit environment for a child. I am taking Leo to my house until you calm down and clean up this mess. She stepped forward, attempting to push past me toward the hallway where Leo was sleeping. Every maternal instinct in my body flared into a blinding rage. I moved instantly, stepping directly into her path and planting my feet firmly on the hardwood floor. I am 5 inches taller than Brenda, and in that moment I used every bit of my leverage to physically block her advance. Do not take another step, I commanded, my voice echoing off the walls with an authority I did not know I possessed. You will never take my son anywhere. You are not a concerned grandmother. You are an accessory to felony child endangerment. The only reason you are not sitting in a jail cell right now is because the police want to build an airtight case against your son first. Brenda stopped, her face flushing a deep, angry red. You have no right to keep my grandson from me. I will call my lawyer right now. I will tell child services that you are mentally unstable and living in a broken, freezing house. Call them. I shot back, stepping even closer to her until she was forced to retreat a step toward the door. Call the caseworker. She was here last night, and she saw the camera footage of Greg throwing Leo onto the floor before locking him in. She also saw your text messages. She knows exactly who you are. If you do not turn around and walk out of my house this exact second, I will call the police and have you arrested for criminal trespassing. Brenda stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a comeback. But she found none. The absolute certainty in my voice left no room for debate. She grabbed the handle of the broken front door, yanking it open. She glared at me one last time, her eyes filled with undisguised hatred. You are going to regret this, Natalie, she spat bitterly. When Greg gets home, you are going to lose everything. She stormed out, slamming the damaged door behind her. I stood in the freezing entryway, watching her car speed out of the driveway. She thought she was issuing a threat, but all she did was give me my next objective. I was not going to wait for Greg to come home to lose everything. I was going to make sure that by the time his flight landed, he had absolutely nothing left to return to. Once Brenda's car disappeared down the street, I locked the damaged door as best as I could and leaned against the wood, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The house was still freezing. The piece of cardboard I had taped over the shattered kitchen window was already buckling under the brutal Chicago wind. I could hear Leo stirring in the hallway, his small voice calling out for breakfast. I had to get the house properly sealed, and I had to get food for my son. I dressed Leo in his warmest winter coat, pulled on a pair of jeans, and drove us to a nearby home improvement superstore. I grabbed a shopping cart and placed Leo in the front seat, trying to offer him a reassuring smile that I did not actually feel. We moved quickly through the aisles. I tossed a heavy-duty plastic tarp, industrial duct tape, and a portable electric space heater into the basket. Then we headed to the grocery section, where I grabbed milk bread, fresh fruit, and a box of his favorite cereal. I pushed the cart up to the checkout register, mentally calculating the quickest way to install the plastic sheeting before the afternoon temperature dropped even further. The cashier scanned the items, bagged them efficiently, and read off the total. $142. I reached into my wallet and pulled out my primary debit card, sliding the chip into the card reader. The machine processed for a few seconds, emitted a sharp negative beep, and flashed a red message across the small screen. Declined. I frowned, assuming my bank had triggered a fraud alert because I had changed my flight schedule so abruptly the night before. I smiled apologetically at the cashier, pulled out my personal credit card, and inserted it. Another processing pause, another sharp beep. Declined. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I pulled out my final card, an emergency credit line I kept strictly for my own personal use, entirely separate from Greg. I swiped it through the machine. The same red text appeared. The cashier shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. "Ma'am, do you have another form of payment?" he asked, quietly aware of the people lining up behind me. My face burned with intense humiliation. I had a master's degree in accounting. I managed million-dollar budgets for corporate clients. And yet here I was standing in a checkout lane, unable to buy a space heater and a gallon of milk for my shivering child. I opened my wallet, pulled out two $50 bills I kept hidden behind my driver's license, and handed them to the cashier. I told him to put the space heater back, paid for the groceries and the tarp, and rushed out of the store with Leo in my arms. When we got back to the car, I strapped Leo into his car seat, handed him an apple, and cranked the car heater up to its maximum setting. My hands were trembling as I pulled out my phone and opened my secure banking application. I needed to know exactly what was happening. The application loaded, bringing up my central financial dashboard. My breath caught in my throat. My personal checking account, which should have had over $6,000 in it, was sitting at absolute zero. My personal savings account was completely empty. Our joint checking account was not just empty, it was overdrawn by $400. But the missing money was not the most terrifying part. Across the top of the screen was a massive red notification banner stating that my entire financial profile had been locked by the fraud department. My CPA training instantly overrode my panic. I tapped on the banner, navigating through the complex banking menus to find the root cause of the freeze. I found the system-generated alert log. My accounts had not been frozen simply because they were empty. They had been aggressively locked down due to a critical system trigger. The alert read, "Complete account restriction, placed due to highly irregular and suspicious debt-to-income ratio spike." I stared at those words until they burned into my retinas. A suspicious debt-to-income ratio spike. In the financial world, that specific terminology only means one thing. It means that within a very short window of time, a massive, uncharacteristic amount of new debt had been forcefully attached to my Social Security number. The terrifying reality of what Greg had done suddenly crystallized in my mind. The $44,000 he spent on his luxury Paris vacation had not been sitting in a secret savings account. Greg did not just drain our cash to buy plane tickets. While I was thousands of feet in the air, flying home to a locked house and an abandoned child, my husband had somehow leveraged my name to initiate financial ruin. He had actively sabotaged my credit, drained my personal safety nets, and ensured that my accounts would be frozen by the time I landed. He wanted me penniless, trapped, and completely unable to fight back. I drove back to the house in a state of absolute shock. The heater in the car was blasting, but I felt completely frozen from the inside out. My mind raced through federal tax codes, banking regulations, and identity theft protocols, desperately trying to calculate how much financial damage Greg could have done in such a short amount of time. I pulled into our driveway, my tires crunching over the frost-covered pavement. I just needed to get inside, tape the heavy plastic tarp over the shattered kitchen window, and feed Leo. But as I shifted the car into park, I saw a sleek gray sedan idling near the curb. I recognized the car immediately. It belonged to Keisha, the woman married to Greg's younger brother, Derek. Keisha is an emergency room nurse at one of the busiest trauma centers in Chicago. She is a sharp, brilliant black woman who always possessed a quiet, commanding presence. At family gatherings, she rarely engaged in the loud, obnoxious debates Greg and his mother loved so much. She usually sat back with a glass of wine, her dark eyes observing every interaction with clinical precision. I had always assumed her silence meant she was aligned with the toxic family hierarchy. I stepped out of the car, pulling Leo tightly against my hip, and grabbed the plastic tarp. Keisha turned off her engine and stepped out into the freezing wind. She was wearing her dark blue hospital scrubs and a heavy wool coat. She did not look angry, but her expression was intensely serious. I instantly braced myself for another screaming match, my defensive walls shooting straight up. If Brenda sent you to finish the job, you can turn right around and get back in your car, Keisha. I snapped, my voice trembling with exhaustion and defensive rage. I am not giving Leo to anyone. I do not care what lies Brenda told you. I have already spoken to the police and I will call them again right now. Keisha did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She walked right past my outstretched hand, reached out and pulled the heavy plastic tarp from my grip. "Unlock the door, Natalie," she said, her tone smooth, but carrying the absolute authority of a veteran trauma nurse. "The baby is shivering, and you look like you are about to pass out. I am not here for Brenda. I am here for you. Now let us get inside before the neighbors start staring." I was too exhausted to fight her. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning my key in the deadbolt. We stepped into the freezing wreckage of the living room. Keisha did not gasp at the overturned furniture or the shattered glass scattered across the kitchen floor. She treated the chaotic scene exactly like a messy trauma bay. She gently took Leo from my arms, found a clean bowl in the cupboards, and poured him the dry cereal I had just bought. Then she grabbed the industrial duct tape from my bag, unrolled the heavy plastic tarp, and helped me seal the massive hole in the kitchen window, instantly cutting off the biting winter draft. Once Leo was sitting safely on the sofa with his breakfast, Keisha walked over to the front door and locked the deadbolt from the inside. She turned to face me, reaching into the deep pocket of her wool coat. She pulled out a thick, tightly folded manila envelope and tossed it onto the center of the coffee table. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the quiet room. "You know," Natalie Keisha began, crossing her arms over her chest, "for 5 years I have sat at that woman's dining table every single Sunday. I listened to Brenda treat Greg like a king, and I listened to them make their little passive-aggressive comments about how much you work. They think I am stupid because I do not talk at their dinners. They think because I am quiet, I am just going to nod along with whatever nonsense they spin." She stepped closer, her dark eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, unwavering intensity. "But I make my living observing people on the worst days of their lives. I see through the lies. When Brenda called Derek this morning, screaming that you had a mental breakdown and smashed your own windows, I knew instantly that she was covering something up. So I went over to her house under the guise of checking on her blood pressure. She was pacing in her kitchen, completely frantic, screaming at a lawyer on the phone. She was so distracted she did not even notice me walk into the formal dining room." Keisha pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the thick envelope resting on the table. "But I noticed what she left sitting right out in the open," Keisha said, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "I took pictures of every single page and printed them out in the hospital administrative office before I came here. Look what I found on Brenda's dining table." I reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the thick manila envelope from the coffee table. The paper felt unusually heavy in my hands. I slid my thumb under the flap, tore it open, and pulled out a stack of crisp white legal documents. The bold black text at the very top of the first page instantly made the air in my lungs evaporate. It was a petition for dissolution of marriage, a divorce filing. I scanned the top section. The petitioner was listed as Greg. The respondent was me. But it was the date stamped in the upper right corner that made my stomach aggressively churn. This document had not been drafted yesterday in a fit of panic. It had been formally filed with the county courthouse exactly 3 weeks ago. For almost a month, the man I shared a bed with had been secretly plotting to end our marriage, smiling over dinner, while his lawyer prepared to destroy my life. "Read the custody section," Keisha instructed, quietly leaning back against the armrest of the sofa. "Read what he told the court." I flipped to the third page, my eyes tracking the dense legal jargon. When I reached the section regarding our son, my blood turned to absolute ice. Greg was not just asking for a divorce. He was demanding 100% sole physical and legal custody of Leo. The justification provided in the petition was a masterclass in character assassination. The document described me as an absent, negligent mother who routinely prioritized high-stakes corporate audits over the physical and emotional welfare of my minor child. Greg claimed I worked 80-hour weeks, abandoned the family for constant business trips, and possessed an explosive, unstable temperament that created a toxic environment for our son. "It is completely fabricated," I whispered, staring at the pages in horror. "I work 40 hours a week. I take Leo to the park every single Sunday. I am the one who schedules his pediatrician appointments, buys his clothes, and reads him to sleep." Greg does not even know the name of Leo's preschool teacher. "Keep reading," Keisha urged, her jaw set in a hard line. "Look at the financial demands." I flipped to the next section. "Because I am a certified public accountant with a lucrative salary, and Greg is a mid-level sales manager who barely meets his monthly quotas, he was legally requesting an aggressive amount of permanent spousal support. He wanted me to pay him massive monthly alimony, claiming he had sacrificed his own career advancement to be the primary caretaker for Leo. He was also demanding exclusive possession of our marital home and requiring me to cover all of his legal fees." The pieces of the puzzle aggressively slammed together in my mind, forming a terrifying, crystal-clear picture. The drained bank accounts, the frozen credit lines, the secret trip to Paris. It was not just reckless spending. It was a highly coordinated, premeditated strike. Greg emptied the account so I would have absolutely no money to hire a defense attorney when he dropped these papers on me. But the most sinister part of his plan was what he did last night. I looked up at Keisha, the horrifying realization washing over my face. "This weekend was a setup," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Greg knew I was supposed to be in Denver until Friday night. He deliberately left Leo alone and locked the doors. Brenda was supposed to come over this morning, pretend to discover that Leo was abandoned, and immediately call Child Protective Services." Keisha nodded slowly, her dark eyes flashing with intense disgust. "Exactly. Brenda was going to play the heroic grandmother. They were going to tell the authorities that you went on a business trip, neglected to arrange childcare, and left your son to fend for himself while Greg was forced to travel for an emergency. They were going to use this exact weekend to manufacture the ultimate proof for his custody battle. He wanted to frame you for felony abandonment." The sheer evil of his calculation was breathtaking. Greg was willing to put our 4-year-old son in genuine life-threatening danger just to secure a favorable divorce settlement and a massive monthly paycheck from my salary. If I had not listened to my gut instinct, if I had not changed my flight and come home a day early to smash that window, his plan would have worked flawlessly. I would have landed in Chicago tonight to find my son in state custody and a restraining order preventing me from seeing him. Instead, Greg's trap had snapped shut on his own leg. Because I came home early, the security camera captured him physically pushing Leo away and locking the door. The police had already seen it. The child services caseworker had already seen it. He thought he was building an airtight case against me, but he had just handed me the federal evidence I needed to completely obliterate him. I carefully aligned the edges of the divorce petition and placed it back on the coffee table. I did not feel like crying anymore. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, mechanical focus. "Thank you, Keisha," I said, looking directly at my sister-in-law. "You just gave me the blueprint to his entire strategy." Keisha offered a sharp, dangerous smile. "I do not like bullies, Natalie, and I especially do not like men who use children as collateral damage. So what is the plan?" I picked up my phone and unlocked the screen. "The plan," I replied smoothly, "is to let him keep digging his own grave. I am going to use my CPA license to rip his financial life to shreds before his flight even touches down." I walked into the kitchen, picked up my phone, and dialed my managing partner at the accounting firm. I did not offer any emotional apologies or elaborate excuses. I simply told him I was dealing with a severe family emergency and would be taking an immediate leave of absence. He agreed without hesitation, offering his full support. When I ended the call, I looked over at Keisha. She was already sitting on the floor with Leo helping him build a tall tower out of plastic blocks. She gave me a single affirming nod. I had the time. I had the backup. Now it was time to go to work. I cleared every single item off the large dining room table, stripping it down to the bare mahogany wood. This was no longer a place for family meals or polite conversation. It was a war room. I brought out my work laptop, a stack of yellow legal pads, several highlighters, and the thick manila envelope of divorce papers Keisha had intercepted. I sat down in the wooden chair, took a deep breath, and mentally compartmentalized the betrayal. I could not be a crying wife right now. I had to be a forensic accountant. In any divorce proceeding, the first rule of asset protection is to secure the real estate. Our house was our largest marital asset. We had bought it 5 years ago, and thanks to an aggressive payment schedule I had personally managed with my own salary, we had built up a significant amount of equity. If Greg was planning to leave me financially destitute, the house was the most obvious target. I opened my web browser and navigated directly to the Cook County Recorder's Office public database. I entered our property identification number and hit search. The system generated a list of all recorded documents attached to our address. The deed was there, the original mortgage was there, but right at the very top of the list was a brand new entry. A document had been officially recorded exactly 14 days ago. My heart slammed against my ribs as I clicked the link to download the scanned PDF file. The document loaded on my screen, and the bold heading confirmed my absolute worst fear. It was a home equity line of credit, commonly known as a HELOC. The total approved credit limit was $150,000. Greg had taken out a second mortgage on our home. That was how he bypassed our joint checking accounts and bypassed his own meager salary. He had effectively mortgaged the roof over his own child's head to fund his luxury lifestyle and his legal assault against me. But a HELOC requires the signatures of all property owners. The bank would never approve a loan of that magnitude without my explicit notarized consent. I scrolled rapidly down to the final page of the document, hunting for the signature block. There it was, my printed name, and right above it, a signature written in blue ink. I stared at the screen, my blood boiling. The signature spelled my name, but the handwriting was entirely wrong. The loop on the capital N was too wide, and the trailing letters were jagged. It was a clumsy, desperate forgery. Greg had signed my name. He had committed federal bank fraud. I looked closer at the bottom corner of the page. Beside the forged signature was a black ink stamp. A notary public had legally certified that I was physically present and had signed the document in front of them. The notary's name was printed beneath the stamp, David Mitchell. I did not recognize the name, but it did not matter. Greg had obviously found a corrupt notary or a foolish friend willing to break federal law for a quick favor. I wrote David Mitchell's name down on my legal pad and circled it 3 times in bright red ink. He was going to lose his license, and he was going straight to jail right alongside my husband. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling as my brain ran the calculations. The math was not adding up. The bank had approved a line of credit for $150,000. The luxury vacation to Paris, including the flights, the hotel, and the VIP soccer tickets, had cost exactly $44,000. I grabbed my pen and scribbled the numbers onto the yellow pad. 150,000 minus 44,000. The remainder was exactly $106,000. Where was the rest of the money? Greg was reckless, but he was not stupid enough to leave over $100,000 sitting in an account where I could find it. He had extracted the maximum amount of cash possible from our home equity, spent a fraction of it on his European getaway, and vanished the rest. I stared at the divorce papers Keisha had brought me. He was demanding I pay him alimony, claiming he had no assets. He was hiding the cash to make himself look broke on paper. I just had to find out exactly where he buried it. The realization that this was a highly calculated financial extraction made my focus sharpen into a deadly point. If Greg thought he could outsmart a certified public accountant in a game of hiding assets, he had drastically underestimated the woman he married. I pulled up a secondary banking portal, preparing to trace every single wire transfer that had originated from that fraudulent loan. I opened my secure banking application on my laptop, navigating directly to the loan servicing division. Since the fraudulent line of credit was technically attached to my home and my social security number, I had full administrative access to view the disbursement history. The portal loaded, displaying a clean, terrifying ledger. Because I had spent years building a flawless credit score, the automated underwriting system had pushed the loan through without requiring a physical appraisal. The bank had released the $150,000 in a single lump sum directly into a temporary holding account Greg had opened solely in his name. From there, the money had been split and wired out immediately. I clicked on the wire transfer logs. The first outgoing transaction was exactly as I suspected. $44,000 wired internationally to an offshore account associated with the luxury sports concierge service in Europe. That paid for his flights, his hotel suite, and the VIP soccer tickets. But my eyes locked onto the second transaction, $106,000 wired domestically. The recipient was not listed as a person. It was listed as a corporate entity, the B.R. Vance Revocable Living Trust. I stared at the screen, my mind racing to process the legal structure. A revocable living trust is a legal entity designed to hold assets outside of standard probate court. It is often used to shield money during litigation. B.R. Vance, Brenda Vance. He gave it to his mother. I said, my voice eerily calm as I turned the laptop screen so Keisha could see the ledger, the remaining $106,000. He wired it into a trust account controlled entirely by Brenda. Keisha leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she read the digital transfer log. A trust account. Why would he do that instead of just keeping it in a separate private checking account for himself? Because if he held the cash in his own name, it would be subject to discovery during the divorce proceedings. I explained the sinister brilliance of his plan finally coming into full focus. He knew I would hire a forensic accountant to track marital assets. By transferring the cash to a trust controlled by his mother before filing the divorce papers, he effectively laundered the money out of our marital estate. When we stood in front of a judge, Greg would claim he was broke. He would claim I had the high-paying job, and he had absolutely nothing to his name. Keisha stood up from the sofa, pacing the length of the living room. Her boots clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. So let me get this straight. They forged your signature to take out a massive loan against your house. They used a portion of that loan to fund his vacation, and they hid the rest in her name. Yes, I replied, feeling a cold, heavy knot form in my stomach. The bank legally attached the debt to the property. If I want to keep this house for Leo, I will have to pay back the entire $150,000. Greg and Brenda planned to steal the physical equity of my home, turn it into liquid cash, and walk away clean while I drown in debt. It is a calculated financial assassination. The moment the divorce was finalized, Brenda would simply gift the money back to him tax-free, and they would both laugh while I faced foreclosure and bankruptcy. Keisha stopped pacing. She looked toward the broken kitchen window, then back at me, a dangerous fire lighting up her eyes. Not if we find the account and freeze it first. You need the exact routing details for that trust to report the wire fraud, right? I nodded. The bank portal shows the receiving institution, but the account number is heavily redacted for security purposes. I need the full account details to file an emergency federal freeze. If I do not get it, Brenda could walk into a branch tomorrow and transfer the money offshore. Keisha reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Give me 10 minutes, she said, her thumbs flying across the screen. When I was at Brenda's house this morning, taking pictures of those divorce papers, I also saw a stack of mail she had sorted on her kitchen island. She is incredibly old-fashioned. She refuses to do paperless billing. I remember seeing a thick, oversized envelope from a wealth management firm in Boston. You did not take a picture of her bank statements, did you? I asked, feeling a sudden surge of hope. No. Keisha smiled sharply. But I know her password formula. Brenda uses the same predictable string of numbers and letters for every single account she owns. It is Derek's birth year, Greg's birth year, and the name of her childhood dog. She made me set up her new tablet last month and complained the whole time about having to remember it. Keisha sat down next to me at the dining table, opened a private browsing window on her phone, and navigated to the wealth management firm's website. She typed in Brenda's email address, entered the absurdly simple password, and hit enter. The screen buffered for a second before successfully logging into the client dashboard. Keisha turned the phone toward me. Right at the top of the screen was the BR, Vance Revocable Living Trust. The balance was exactly $106,000. Below it was the unredacted routing number and the full account number. Got her, Keisha whispered. I grabbed my pen and copied the numbers onto my legal pad. The trap they had set for me was deep, but they had left a digital trail a mile wide. I had the forged loan documents. I had the wire transfer logs. I had the destination account. The evidence was absolute and irrefutable. Now it was time to drop the hammer. I was not just going to divorce my husband. I was going to ensure that he and his mother answered to the federal government for wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. I sat back in my chair, staring at the routing numbers written in bright red ink on my yellow legal pad. We had the financial evidence completely locked down. But Keisha was not finished. She closed out of the wealth management portal and opened the Instagram application on her phone. Greg is arrogant, Keisha said, her thumbs moving quickly across the screen. He just spent $44,000 on a vanity trip to Europe. There is absolutely no way a man with an ego that fragile goes to Paris and does not brag about it on social media. She navigated to a burner profile she used specifically to keep tabs on extended family members without them knowing. She typed in Greg's username. His profile was public, and just as Keisha predicted, his page was glowing with a bright ring indicating multiple news story updates posted within the last 24 hours. We leaned in together, watching the high-definition video clips play out on the small screen. The first video was a sweeping panoramic shot from the balcony of his five-star hotel suite, showcasing an unobstructed view of the Eiffel Tower sparkling in the night sky. The caption across the bottom read, "Living my best life. Much needed peace and quiet." The sheer audacity of the caption made my stomach turn. His idea of peace and quiet was leaving his 4-year-old son locked in a freezing, dark house. The next video was taken from inside the VIP hospitality suite at the European soccer final. Greg was holding a glass of expensive champagne, panning the camera around to show off the catered food and the perfect view of the field. But as the camera swung back toward his face, he made a careless mistake. He caught the reflection of the glass window behind him. "Pause it right there," I said sharply, pointing at the screen. Keisha tapped the screen, freezing the frame. In the reflection behind Greg's shoulder, there was a woman. She was wearing a sleek designer dress, holding her own glass of champagne, and leaning in close to him. She was not just a random fan in the stadium. "Swipe to the next picture," Keisha muttered, her eyes narrowing in concentration. The final post was a static photograph taken at a Michelin star restaurant. Greg was smiling at the camera, a plate of truffles in front of him. He had not tagged anyone in the photo, but a woman's manicured hand with a distinctive silver ring was resting intimately over his wrist on the edge of the table. Keisha took a screenshot of the photo and quickly cropped it, zooming in on the small portion of the woman's face that had been caught in the edge of the frame. She stared at the screen for a long moment, her brow furrowed. "I know that face," Keisha whispered, her tone shifting from curious to deeply suspicious. "I saw her just a few weeks ago, but it was not at a family gathering." She reached across the table and grabbed the thick manila envelope containing the divorce petition. She flipped to the very last page where the name and address of Greg's sleazy divorce attorney were printed in bold letters. The law firm was called Harrison and Associates. Keisha typed the name of the firm into her mobile browser and clicked on the staff directory page. She scrolled past the senior partners and the junior associates until she reached the support staff section. She stopped, turned the phone around, and placed it flat on the table next to the screenshot from Paris. It was a perfect match. The woman in the designer dress sipping champagne in Paris was smiling back at us in a professional corporate headshot. Her name was printed below the photo, Nicole Davis, senior paralegal. My jaw literally dropped. Greg was not just having a random affair. He was sleeping with the paralegal assigned to our divorce case. He had taken his lawyer's staff member on a luxury vacation funded entirely by wire fraud and forged documents. Keisha let out a dark, echoing laugh. Well, look at that. He did not just cheat on you. He compromised his entire legal defense. My mind immediately began calculating the sheer destructive power of this new information. In the legal profession, a staff member engaging in a romantic or financial relationship with a client during active litigation is a massive ethical violation. It is a severe conflict of interest that borders on absolute legal malpractice. If the lead attorney knew about the affair, he could be disbarred. If he did not know, he would be forced to immediately drop Greg as a client the second I reported the violation to the State Bar Association. Greg thought he had built an impenetrable fortress. He thought he had the money, the lawyer, and the perfect setup to destroy my life. Instead, through his own staggering arrogance, he had handed me the exact weapon I needed to obliterate his legal representation. When he returned to Chicago to face federal felony charges, he would not have a high-priced lawyer standing beside him. He would have absolutely no one. Most women would have picked up their phones the second they saw that photograph. They would have called their husbands, screamed into the receiver, demanded answers, cried, or threatened to burn all their clothes. I looked at the screenshot of Greg and his lawyer's paralegal, then calmly locked my phone screen. Silence is the most terrifying weapon you can use against a narcissist. I did not text him. I did not block his number. I went completely ghost. I turned back to my dining room table and started organizing the mountain of paperwork into a thick black 3-ring binder. Keisha stayed with me until well past midnight, helping me index every single piece of evidence with neatly labeled tabs. Section A was the police incident report and the security camera footage of him physically abandoning our terrified child. Section B contained the forged loan documents and the fraudulent notary stamp. Section C held the detailed wire transfer logs, tracking the movement of $150,000. Section D was dedicated entirely to the screenshots of his romantic Parisian getaway with his legal counsel's staff member. By the time the sun came up on Friday morning, I held a masterclass in federal financial crimes in my hands. My first stop was not a local retail bank branch. As a certified public accountant, I knew a standard branch manager would not have the authority or the clearance to execute the kind of emergency freezes I needed. I drove downtown to the regional corporate headquarters of my financial institution. I bypassed the tellers entirely and requested an immediate escalated meeting with the director of the Fraud Investigation Unit. Because of my corporate credentials and the severity of my claims, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room within 10 minutes. I slid the black binder across the polished mahogany table to the lead investigator. I sat quietly and watched his expression change from polite corporate concern to absolute shock as he reviewed the forged signature on the home equity line of credit and the subsequent wire transfers. I explained precisely how the money had been siphoned into a revocable living trust controlled by my mother-in-law to intentionally launder marital assets ahead of a surprise divorce filing. The investigator did not ask me to fill out a standard dispute form. He picked up his desk phone, bypassed standard protocols, and connected directly with the bank's federal compliance officer. Within 15 minutes, the bank initiated a hard, unyielding administrative freeze on the fraudulent loan account. More importantly, because the funds had been transferred across state lines using a forged instrument, they executed a federal clawback hold on Brenda's trust account. Her $106,000 were instantly paralyzed. She could not withdraw a single cent, transfer a dime, or close the account. The investigator assured me that the bank would be pursuing criminal forgery charges against the notary and Greg independently of my own legal actions. I thanked him, took my binder, and walked out into the cold Chicago morning feeling a massive surge of raw power. The financial pipeline was completely severed. But freezing the accounts was only the defensive strategy. I needed an offensive strike. I drove directly from the bank headquarters to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office. White-collar crime is notoriously difficult to prosecute because the paper trail is usually buried under layers of complex corporate obfuscation. But Greg had been incredibly sloppy. He was a salesman, not an accountant. He had left his digital fingerprints all over the ledger. I sat across from a federal agent in a sterile windowless interview room and handed over the binder. I walked the agent through the exact timeline of the fraud. I showed him how the fraudulent loan was taken out using my stolen identity, how the funds were wired to an accessory, and how the perpetrator was currently spending the stolen money overseas. The agent carefully reviewed the notary stamp on the forged document and cross-referenced the wire transfer logs. He informed me that wire fraud exceeding $100,000 when combined with aggravated identity theft carried mandatory minimum federal prison sentences. He made authorized copies of the entire binder specifically highlighting the involvement of the corrupt notary and Brenda's trust account. They were officially opening a federal criminal probe. I left the field office just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I had systematically dismantled Greg's entire financial and legal infrastructure in a single morning. He had no money. He had a compromised lawyer. He was actively under investigation by the bank, the local police, and the federal government. And the absolute best part was that he had absolutely no idea. He was still in Paris sipping champagne and living his best life, completely unaware that he was flying home to a cage. I drove back to my house under a heavy, overcast Chicago sky. The adrenaline that had carried me through the bank headquarters and the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office was slowly settling into a cold, hardened resolve. When I walked through the damaged front door, the house was remarkably quiet. Keisha had stayed to watch Leo and was currently sitting on the living room rug building a complicated fortress out of plastic blocks with him. The heavy industrial tarp we had taped over the shattered kitchen window rustled slightly in the winter wind. It served as a constant physical reminder of the nightmare Greg had orchestrated. I set my keys on the counter and poured myself a tall glass of water. Before I could even take a sip, my phone buzzed violently against the marble countertop. I glanced down at the glowing screen. A new text message notification from Greg. I unlocked the phone and opened the thread. His message read exactly like the fake confident persona he projected to the outside world, dripping with manufactured affection. Cannot wait to see you and my little man tomorrow. My flight lands at 9 in the morning. Hope you kept the house clean while I was grinding away on this business trip. Love you guys. I stared at the black text on the bright screen. The sheer psychological manipulation was breathtaking. He was texting the wife he had actively tried to ruin, asking about the child he had violently peeled off his leg and locked in a freezing house. And he was doing it while likely sitting in a luxury Parisian hotel suite, funded by a fraudulent second mortgage with his lawyer's paralegal right beside him. He was testing the waters. He knew my flight from Denver was originally scheduled to land on Friday evening. He was sending this message to see if I had discovered Leo yet, or if Brenda had successfully executed her part of the plan and called Child Protective Services. He wanted to know exactly what kind of scene he was walking into. I carried the phone into the living room and handed it down to Keisha. She scanned the text message, her lips pressing into a thin, disgusted line. She looked up at me and handed the device back. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly, ensuring her voice stayed low so Leo would not overhear. "If you do not reply, he might get suspicious. If you blow up and tell him the truth, he will drain whatever cash he has left and run to a country without an extradition treaty before his plane ever touches down in Chicago." Keisha was exactly right. I needed him to board that flight. I needed him to walk through my front door. I needed him arrogant, comfortable, and completely blind to the federal trap waiting for him. I tapped the reply box on my screen. I did not use capital letters or angry punctuation. I kept my digital tone exactly as it always was, compliant and calm. "We cannot wait to see you too," I typed. "Have a safe flight. I have a huge surprise waiting for you in the living room." I hit send and watched the message bubble turn green. A few seconds later, 3 small dots appeared on the screen indicating he was typing. His reply came through almost instantly. "Sounds great, babe. See you tomorrow." He took the bait entirely. He probably thought the surprise was a newly purchased watch, a special breakfast, or simply his obedient wife waiting to cater to his exhaustion. He had absolutely no idea that the surprise was a completely drained financial portfolio, an active federal warrant, and a forensic accounting binder detailing his federal crimes. Now, we had to prepare the physical space. I looked at Keisha. "I need you here tomorrow morning," I said. "When he walks through that door, I want a witness. But more importantly, I do not want Leo anywhere near the entryway when the police arrive. I need you to keep him safe in the back playroom." Keisha nodded immediately, her expression fierce and determined. "I will be here at 8, she promised. "Derek thinks I am picking up an extra shift at the hospital trauma center. He has no idea what his brother has done, and I intend to keep it that way until Greg is sitting in the back of a squad car." With Keisha watching Leo, I walked into our master bedroom and pulled Greg's secondary suitcase from the top shelf of the closet. I did not fold his clothes. I did not carefully pack his expensive shoes. I grabbed armfuls of his tailored suits, his casual wear, and his toiletries, dumping them haphazardly into the luggage. I zipped the heavy bag shut and dragged it down the hallway, leaving it sitting right next to the splintered front door. He was not going to make it past the entryway. I pulled out the business card the lead detective had given me on Thursday night and dialed his direct cell phone number. He answered on the second ring. "Detective," I said clearly. "My husband just confirmed his itinerary. He lands at the airport at 9 tomorrow morning. He should be at the house by 10. The detective let out a low, satisfied breath over the line. "Understood, Natalie. We already have units staged in your neighborhood. Let him walk inside. Do not confront him physically. We will be right behind him." That night, after Keisha left and Leo was finally asleep safely in my bed, I sat alone in the living room. I placed the thick black binder of financial evidence squarely in the center of the coffee table. Tomorrow my marriage would officially end. It would not end with a quiet conversation or a tearful goodbye. It would end with the brutal, blinding light of justice. I leaned my head back against the sofa and closed my eyes in the dark. For the first time in 3 days, I actually smiled. Saturday morning arrived with a bitter chill. I sat perfectly still on the living room sofa, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The thick black binder rested exactly in the center of the coffee table. In the back playroom, Keisha was playing a loud animated movie for Leo, keeping him completely distracted and entirely out of sight. At exactly 9:45, a black luxury town car pulled to a smooth stop at the end of our driveway. I watched through the front window as the driver popped the trunk. Greg stepped out of the back seat. He looked incredibly rested. He was wearing his favorite navy-tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled, and a smug, relaxed smile plastered across his face. He grabbed his heavy designer suitcase from the driver, the exact same one I had watched him drag across our living room floor on the security footage. Tucked under his other arm was a bright plastic duty-free shopping bag, undoubtedly filled with cheap last-minute souvenirs he had picked up at the airport terminal to serve as an insulting peace offering. He walked briskly up the concrete path, whistling a faint tune. He reached the porch, pulled out his keys, and slid the brass key into the deadbolt. But the lock did not turn smoothly. The internal mechanism had been entirely destroyed when the police kicked the door open on Thursday night. Greg frowned, jiggled the handle, and finally pushed his shoulder against the heavy wood. The oak door swung inward with a harsh scrape. Greg stepped into the entryway, immediately tripping over the massive canvas duffel bag I had packed with his belongings. He stumbled, dropping the plastic duty-free bag onto the floor. A cheap miniature metal Eiffel Tower spilled out, clattering loudly against the hardwood. He caught his balance and looked down at his clothes spilling out of the hastily zipped bag. Then his eyes darted up, taking in the splintered doorframe, the heavy industrial plastic tarp taped over the shattered kitchen window, and finally me sitting motionless on the sofa. I expected him to ask what happened. I expected at least a fleeting second of panic that his home had been burglarized or his family had been attacked. Instead, his face instantly twisted into a mask of pure irritated condescension. He let out a loud, dramatic sigh, unbuttoning his suit jacket and throwing his hands in the air. "Are you seriously throwing a tantrum?" he demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the cold room. "You smashed the window. You packed my bags. This is exactly what my mother warned me about. You have completely lost your mind over a simple misunderstanding." He kicked his packed duffel bag out of the way and marched into the living room, standing over me with an imposing posture. "I needed a break, Natalie. I work hard, and I had an opportunity to take a quick trip. I knew you were coming home on Friday. I left Leah with plenty of snacks, and the television was on. He is 4 years old, not an infant. He is perfectly fine. You acting like a hysterical maniac and destroying our house just proves that you are entirely unfit to handle any real stress." He pointed a finger aggressively toward the plastic tarp in the kitchen. "Look at this place. You let your ridiculous temper turn our home into a disaster zone. Do you know how much it is going to cost to fix that door and replace that glass? I should be the one furious with you right now. But I am a reasonable man. If you apologize right now, help me unpack, and promise to never pull a stunt like this again, I am willing to move past it. We can just pretend this little psychotic break of yours never happened." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply stared at him, marveling at the sheer depth of his delusion. He was standing in the middle of a crime scene he had created, lecturing me about financial responsibility while he secretly owed a federal bank $150,000. He thought he was entirely in control. He thought his aggressive gaslighting would force me into submission, just like it always had in the past. He thought I was just a nagging wife throwing a fit because he took a luxury vacation without asking permission. I slowly reached forward and rested my fingertips on the smooth black cover of the binder sitting on the coffee table. "You are right about one thing, Greg," I said, my voice cutting through the room with the clinical precision of a surgeon. "The front door and the kitchen window are going to be incredibly expensive to fix, but you do not need to worry about the repair bills, because you do not live here anymore, and you do not own this house anymore." Greg stared at me for a fraction of a second, his arrogant smirk faltering just slightly before he let out a loud, patronizing laugh. He tossed his suit jacket onto the armchair, shaking his head. He was about to launch into another tirade about my supposedly fragile mental state, but before the first word could leave his mouth, the damaged front door was pushed all the way open. The hinges groaned in protest as two figures stepped over the canvas duffel bag sitting in the entryway. It was Brenda. She was wearing a thick cashmere coat and a triumphant, venomous smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She did not look like a grandmother concerned about her grandson. She looked like a predator who had finally cornered her prey. Walking right beside her was a man I had never seen in person, though I recognized his name from the bottom of the legal documents Keisha had intercepted. He wore an aggressively tailored pinstripe suit, his hair slicked back with too much product, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. This was the lead attorney from the law firm of Harrison and Associates. Greg had brought his legal muscles straight to my living room. "Good morning, Natalie," the lawyer said. His voice was smooth, practiced, and dripping with artificial professional courtesy. He did not ask permission to enter my home. He walked straight into the living room, stopped at the edge of the coffee table, and snapped his briefcase open. He pulled out a thick stack of familiar white legal documents and dropped them right next to my black binder. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood felt like a physical threat. "I am representing your husband in the dissolution of your marriage. We tried to serve you at your office yesterday, but we were informed you took an abrupt leave of absence, so we are bringing the reality of your situation directly to you." Greg immediately shifted his posture, crossing his arms and standing shoulder to shoulder with his lawyer. The fake confusion from moments ago vanished, replaced entirely by cold, calculated malice. He had planned this ambush perfectly. He thought I was trapped in a corner with no money, a broken house, and a terrified child. The lawyer tapped his manicured finger against the top page of the divorce petition, adjusting his expensive silk tie as he fully embraced his role as the executioner. Let us skip the theatrics and get straight to the point. He continued, looking down his nose at me. Your husband is requesting full physical and legal custody of your son. He is also requesting exclusive possession of this marital residence and a standard sum of permanent spousal support due to your significantly higher earning capacity. Now we can do this the hard way, dragging your name through a brutal public court battle. Or you can pick up a pen, sign the waiver of service, and agree to the preliminary asset division right now. I looked from the lawyer to the papers, remaining completely silent. When I did not immediately burst into tears or reach for a pen, the lawyer leaned forward, dropping the professional facade. If you refuse to cooperate, my client is prepared to immediately contact Child Protective Services and the local police department. We have a sworn statement from Greg's mother confirming that you abandoned your 4-year-old son to go on a corporate business trip. We will report that you left him alone in a freezing house with broken windows and no supervision. You will be arrested for child endangerment. You will lose your certified public accountant license. You will be ruined financially, professionally, and personally. Brenda stepped out from behind her son, her eyes glittering with absolute delight. She folded her arms over her expensive coat, looking down at me as if I were dirt she had just scraped off her shoe. You really thought you were so smart, Natalie, she sneered, pacing slowly across the ruined living room rug. You thought your fancy degree and your corporate job made you better than us. You thought you could disrespect my son and treat him like an errand boy while you played the big executive. But you are nothing but an unfit, negligent mother. I told Greg years ago that marrying you was a mistake. Now you are going to walk out of this house with nothing but the clothes on your back. Greg nodded in agreement, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. Just sign the papers, Natalie, he demanded, using his best authoritative sales voice. You brought this entirely on yourself. If you sign over the deed to the house today, I will tell the authorities I came home early and managed to prevent a tragedy. I will save you from going to prison. It is the best deal you are ever going to get. They stood in a tight semicircle around the coffee table, a united front of deceit and manipulation. They were absolutely convinced they held all the winning cards. They expected me to beg, to negotiate, or to surrender completely. I did not move. I did not look at the pen the lawyer was holding out to me. I just stared at the three of them, perfectly calm, letting the heavy silence stretch out in the cold room. They had played their hand exactly as I knew they would. Now it was time to introduce them to the audience they did not know was watching. The silence that followed my statement was thick and suffocating. Greg looked at his lawyer, a flicker of genuine confusion finally breaking through his arrogant facade. The lawyer frowned, adjusting his grip on his leather briefcase, clearly assuming I was just making an empty emotional threat to stall the divorce proceedings. Brenda simply rolled her eyes, opening her mouth to launch another volley of condescending insults. But before a single word could escape her lips, the sharp sound of a ceramic coffee mug being set down heavily on the marble kitchen counter echoed through the open floor plan. All three of them whipped their heads toward the kitchen. Keisha stepped casually into the living room, holding a steaming cup of coffee. She was still wearing her dark blue hospital scrubs, her posture completely relaxed, her expression radiating absolute unbothered confidence. She walked slowly to the edge of the living room rug and stood right beside me, forming our own united front against the intruders. Brenda looked as though she had just seen a ghost, followed immediately by a surge of venomous anger. Her face flushed a deep, ugly red, and she pointed a shaking finger at my sister-in-law. "What in the world are you doing here?" Brenda demanded, her voice shrill and trembling with rage. "This is a private legal matter. This is family business. You have absolutely no right to be in this house right now. Get out before I have my lawyer add you to the harassment suit." Keisha took a slow, deliberate sip from her coffee mug. She did not flinch. She did not back down. She looked Brenda up and down with the kind of clinical pity a trauma nurse reserves for a completely lost cause. "Family business." Keisha repeated, her tone smooth and dangerously quiet. "You lost the right to call anything family business the second you helped your son commit federal bank fraud, Brenda. And you certainly lost the right to tell me what to do when you left your entire criminal paper trail sitting right out in the open on your formal dining room table for anyone to find. Brenda physically recoiled, taking a sudden step backward. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She tried to straighten her posture, desperately attempting to summon the aristocratic authority she always used to intimidate people, but her hands were shaking too violently. Greg stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, trying to regain control of the room by raising his voice. "You do not know anything. You are just a nurse. Mind your own business and get out of my house before I call the cops to have you removed." Keisha turned her sharp, calculating gaze toward Greg. "I may just be a nurse, Greg, but I know how to read a bank statement. And I know how to spot a sloppy, desperate forgery. You and your mother really thought you were pulling off the heist of the century. You thought you could forge Natalie's signature on a home equity line of credit, drain $150,000 from this property, and launder the majority of it through a secret account." The color completely drained from Greg's face. He looked frantically at his lawyer, whose professional composure was beginning to rapidly fracture. The lawyer took a large step away from Greg, his eyes darting nervously between Keisha and the thick black binder sitting perfectly centered on the coffee table. Keisha turned her attention back to Brenda, delivering the final crushing blow. "You have spent 5 years looking down on me, Brenda. You sat at every single Thanksgiving dinner making snide comments about my background and my career. You thought because I stayed quiet I was stupid. But you are the one who left a wealth management statement from Boston sitting right next to your coffee pot. You are the one who used a password so simple a child could crack it. I logged into your account yesterday morning. I saw the B.R. Vance Revocable Living Trust. I saw the $106,000 your son wired to you to hide it from the divorce proceedings." Brenda grabbed the arm of the sofa to steady herself, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. "You hacked my bank account," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "That is illegal. I will have you arrested." Keisha let out a dark, echoing laugh that filled the freezing room. "Go ahead and call the cops, Brenda. Please do it. Tell them I looked at your account. Because while you are on the phone, you can also explain to them why you are acting as an accessory to grand larceny and wire fraud. You can explain why you agreed to hold stolen marital funds across state lines. You really thought you were securing your son's financial future. All you actually did was guarantee that you are both going to be sharing a federal indictment." The lawyer held up his hands, his legal survival instincts finally overriding his arrogance. "Wait a minute," he interjected, his voice tight with sudden panic. He looked directly at Greg, his eyes narrowing into a fierce glare. "You told me the funds you paid my retainer with were from a personal savings account. You told me the marital home had no secondary liens. Did you forge your wife's signature on a federal loan document to pay my firm?" Greg stammered, his confident sales persona completely evaporating into thin air. "No, I mean it is complicated. She owes me that money. I am entitled to the equity." Keisha took another sip of her coffee and smiled brightly at the lawyer. "Oh, it gets much better, counselor. You might want to ask your client who he took to Paris on that luxury vacation. Because from the pictures I saw on his social media account last night, your senior paralegal has a whole lot of explaining to do." The lawyer froze completely, his face turning the color of ash. The absolute destruction of their plan was unfolding in real time, and Keisha had delivered the execution with flawless surgical precision. The lawyer did not wait for Greg to formulate another lie. He snapped his leather briefcase shut so forcefully that the sharp click echoed like a gunshot in the tense room. He grabbed the handle, his knuckles turning completely white. He looked at Greg with absolute disgust, completely abandoning his professional composure. "You forged a federal document to pay my retainer," he hissed, his voice shaking with furious indignation. "And you took my senior paralegal to Paris using those stolen funds. You have completely compromised my firm. I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel as of this exact second. Do not ever contact my office again." The lawyer turned sharply on his heel and marched toward the broken front door. Greg reached out, grabbing the sleeve of the attorney's expensive pinstripe suit. "Wait, you cannot just leave me here," Greg pleaded, the panic finally breaking through his voice. "We have a contract. You have to force her to sign the settlement." The lawyer violently yanked his arm away. Our contract is void the minute you committed a felony to secure my services, he spat. You are on your own. He stepped over the canvas duffel bag and stormed out of the house, practically sprinting toward his car. The front door swung shut behind him, leaving Greg completely isolated in the center of the living room. Brenda was still clutching the edge of the sofa, staring blankly at the floor as she processed the reality of her frozen trust account. Keisha leaned against the kitchen island, quietly sipping her coffee, enjoying every single second of the collapse. I slowly walked over to the armchair and sat down. I smoothed the fabric of my cardigan, crossed my legs, and looked directly at the man I had married. Greg was hyperventilating now. His entire safety net had evaporated in less than 3 minutes. But instead of showing remorse, his panic mutated into a blind, desperate rage. He turned his fury entirely on me, stepping toward my chair with his fists clenched. You think you are so clever, he screamed, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. You think you can just scare my lawyer away and keep everything for yourself. I do not care what Keisha thinks she saw on a bank statement. I am your husband. Half of everything you have belongs to me. This house is mine. I pay the property taxes. I maintain the yard. You are going to sign those papers right now, or I will drag you through a custody battle so vicious you will never see Leo again. I will tell the judge you are unstable. I will tell them you smashed the windows. You are going to sign the deed over to me today. He reached down, picked up the thick stack of divorce papers his lawyer had abandoned on the coffee table, and slammed them down right in front of me. Sign it, he demanded. I looked at the crumpled papers. Then I looked up at him, my expression completely void of emotion. I am not signing anything, Greg, I said calmly. And even if I wanted to, I cannot give you this house. What are you talking about? He snapped. Your name is on the deed. Just sign the transfer. I leaned forward and picked up the heavy black binder sitting next to his divorce petition. I flipped it open to the third tab, pulling out a thick stack of official documents bearing the seal of our regional bank and the federal government. I placed them flat on the table and pushed them across the smooth wood until they rested inches from his shaking hands. I cannot give you this house, Greg, because you do not own it anymore, I explained, keeping my voice steady and deliberate. And neither do I. When you forged my signature on that home equity line of credit, you secured the loan against the physical property. But because the signature was fraudulent and the funds were immediately transferred to a third party to conceal assets, the bank triggered a federal default. Greg stared at the documents, his eyes darting across the bold legal text. He saw his own forged signature on the copy of the loan agreement. He saw the official notice of default. As of 9 o'clock yesterday morning, this property is in active federal foreclosure. I continued. The bank has frozen the title. It cannot be sold. It cannot be transferred. It cannot be divided in a divorce settlement. You tried to steal the equity, but all you actually did was hand the deed straight to the federal government. I reached into the binder again and pulled out the final piece of paper. It was a formal incident report bearing the stark, intimidating logo of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I slid it directly on top of the foreclosure notice. And this, I said softly, is the confirmation receipt from the federal field office downtown. I sat with an agent yesterday afternoon. I gave them the security camera footage of you abandoning our son. I gave them the forged loan documents. I gave them the wire transfer logs to your mother's trust account. Greg stopped breathing. He stared at the letters FBI printed at the top of the page. His arrogant posture crumbled completely. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of the coffee table. He looked exactly like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine that had already detonated. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by a harsh grating sound. It was Brenda. She threw her head back and let out a loud theatrical laugh. She stepped out from behind the sofa, completely misreading the absolute terror paralyzing her son. She looked at the FBI incident report sitting on the coffee table and waved her hand dismissively, as if it were nothing more than a poorly written grocery list. You honestly think you can intimidate us with a few printed papers? Brenda scoffed, her voice dripping with unearned confidence. You are just trying to scare him because you know you are losing. Greg, stop looking like someone just shot you. If she wants to play hardball over this ridiculous house, let her have the broken drywall and the mortgage payments. We do not need this property. Brenda walked over and placed her manicured hand on Greg's frozen shoulder, puffing her chest out proudly. I have $106,000 sitting safely in a private wealth management trust right now. She declared, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute arrogance. I have the liquid cash to buy you out of whatever pathetic settlement you think you are entitled to. We will write you a check today, and Greg will walk away clean. You can keep this ruined house and your miserable little life. We hold the real money. I looked at Brenda, feeling a deep, profound sense of pity mixed with absolute triumph. She was so blinded by her desire to protect her golden child and defeat me that she was loudly confessing to a federal crime in front of a witness. She was openly bragging about holding the exact funds her son had stolen. I leaned back in my armchair, resting my hands neatly in my lap. Brenda, I asked, my voice carrying a deceptive, quiet calm. Where exactly do you think that $106,000 came from? Did you honestly believe your son, a mid-level sales manager who drives a leased car and complains about grocery bills, suddenly won the lottery? Brenda narrowed her eyes, her confident smile faltering just a fraction. He earned it. He transferred it to me for safekeeping because he knew you would try to steal it during the divorce. I shook my head slowly. He did not earn a single penny of it, Brenda. That money is the equity from this house. It is the money he acquired by forging my signature on a federal banking document. And the moment he wired those stolen funds across state lines into your private trust account to hide them from a divorce proceeding, that money officially became stolen property. Brenda let out another laugh, but this time it was thin, breathless, and completely devoid of humor. You are lying, she snapped. You are just trying to confuse the issue. My trust account is entirely secure. You cannot touch it. I did not have to touch it, I replied, picking up the official bank freeze authorization from the binder and holding it up for her to see. The federal government touched it for me. When I sat with the corporate fraud investigator yesterday morning, I gave them the unredacted routing numbers for your revocable living trust. The bank traced the fraudulent wire transfer directly to your name. They executed an immediate federal clawback hold. The color vanished from Brenda's face. Her hand dropped heavily from Greg's shoulder. Your trust is completely frozen, Brenda, I stated, enunciating every single syllable so the reality would finally penetrate her delusion. You cannot withdraw $1. You cannot transfer a cent. You cannot close the account. But the lost money is actually the least of your problems right now. Brenda began to shake. She dug frantically into her expensive cashmere coat, pulling out her smartphone. Her fingers trembled violently as she opened her mobile banking application, desperately typing in her password to check her wealth management dashboard. I watched her face as the screen loaded. I did not need to see the phone to know exactly what she was looking at. I knew she was staring at a massive, bright red banner indicating a complete administrative lockdown. By accepting that wire transfer, I continued relentlessly. You knowingly conspired to hide marital assets. But because those assets were obtained through a forged federal loan, you are no longer just a toxic mother-in-law. Under federal law, you are now an accessory after the fact to grand larceny. And because you allowed stolen funds to be deposited into an account bearing your name to conceal their origin, you are guilty of money laundering. A sharp, satisfied chuckle came from the kitchen area. Keisha pushed off the marble island and walked slowly toward the living room, her eyes fixed entirely on Brenda. I told you, Brenda, Keisha said, her voice practically purring with vindication. I told you that leaving your bank statements out in the open was a terrible idea. You thought you were outsmarting the system. You thought you were securing your son's financial freedom. Instead, you just handed the FBI everything they need to seize your remaining assets and charge you with a felony. Brenda dropped her phone. The expensive device hit the hardwood floor with a loud crack, the screen splintering just like her entire reality. She looked at Greg, her eyes wide with a sudden horrifying realization. Her golden boy had not secured their future. He had dragged her directly into a federal criminal indictment. She opened her mouth to speak, to yell, to deny it, but all that came out was a high-pitched, gasping sob. The untouchable matriarch was finally broken. The suffocating silence that followed Brenda's realization was suddenly shattered by 3 heavy, authoritative strikes against the damaged front door. The knocks were so forceful they rattled the splintered wood in its hinges. It was not the polite tap of a neighbor or the hesitant knock of a delivery driver. It was the unmistakable, commanding pound of law enforcement. Greg jumped backward as if he had been physically struck. His eyes darted from the front door to the thick black binder on the coffee table, a wild, trapped animal panic completely taking over his features. Brenda let out a sharp gasp, taking another step away from her son as her self-preservation instincts finally kicked in. Before anyone could move to answer it, the heavy oak door was pushed open. The deadbolt had been destroyed on Thursday night, offering absolutely no resistance. The cold Chicago wind rushed into the entryway, bringing with it the lead detective from 2 nights ago. He was flanked by 2 heavily built, uniformed police officers, resting their hands casually on their duty belts. The detective stepped over Greg's packed canvas duffel bag without looking down. His sharp eyes scanned the living room, dismissing Keisha and Brenda entirely, before locking directly onto Greg. Greg's survival instincts flared. He immediately forced his panic down and attempted to deploy the exact same manipulative charm he used to close sales deals. He rushed toward the detective, holding his hands up in a gesture of exaggerated exhaustion. He plastered a look of deep concern across his face, entirely abandoning his aggressive posture from moments ago. "Thank God you are here, officers," Greg said, his voice dripping with manufactured relief. "I am so glad someone called you. I just got home from an exhausting overseas business trip, and I walked into a complete nightmare. My wife is having some kind of severe psychotic break. She smashed our kitchen window, she packed my bags, and she is threatening my mother with all sorts of crazy financial delusions. She is completely unstable. I am honestly worried for my own safety and the safety of my son." He stopped a few feet from the officers, waiting for them to nod in sympathy. He fully expected them to look at the broken glass, look at my stoic expression, and immediately treat me as the hysterical woman he painted me to be. He was a well-dressed, articulate, white-collar professional, standing in a wealthy suburban neighborhood. He assumed the badge would naturally side with the suit. The lead detective did not nod. He did not offer a sympathetic smile. He stared at Greg with a level of absolute, undisguised contempt that made the air in the room grow even colder. The detective reached into his heavy winter jacket and pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs. The metal clinked sharply in the quiet room. Gregory, the detective, set his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut right through Greg's pathetic lies. "I stood in this exact room 2 nights ago. I watched a high-definition security video of you shoving your sobbing 4-year-old son onto the floor, walking out the door, and locking it behind you from the outside. I watched him shivering in the dark while you were sitting in first class on a flight to Paris." Greg's mouth fell open. The charismatic salesman routine died instantly in his throat. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes wide with genuine horror as he realized I had not been bluffing. I had not just threatened to call the police. The police had been waiting for him the entire time. "Wait!" Greg stammered, raising his hands defensively. "You do not understand. It was a misunderstanding. I thought my mother was coming over. I texted her. Ask her. She was supposed to be here." He frantically pointed a shaking finger at Brenda, desperately trying to throw his own mother under the bus to save himself. But the detective did not even look at Brenda. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the detective commanded, taking a decisive step forward. The 2 uniformed officers moved in perfect synchronization, flanking Greg and cutting off any possible avenue of escape. "You cannot do this!" Greg shouted, his voice cracking as the reality of his total destruction finally set in. "I own this house. I have rights. I have a lawyer." "Your lawyer quit 3 minutes ago." Keisha noted cheerfully from the kitchen island, raising her coffee mug in a mock salute. Greg lunged backward, but he was entirely outmatched. The two uniformed officers grabbed his arms, spinning him around with practiced efficiency. They forced his wrists together behind his back. The sharp mechanical click of the handcuffs ratcheting tight echoed loudly against the hardwood floor. "Gregory, you are under arrest for felony child endangerment and criminal abandonment." The lead detective recited his tone completely devoid of emotion. "Furthermore, we have been instructed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to hold you without bail, pending their own active federal warrants for wire fraud forgery and aggravated identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. Given how much you have already admitted to, I highly suggest you start using it." Greg was breathing heavily, his chest heaving against his tailored navy suit. His perfect hair was disheveled. He looked over his shoulder at me, his eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of hatred and absolute defeat. He had expected to walk in and conquer a broken, submissive wife. Instead, he was leaving his home in chains, entirely stripped of his money, his freedom, and his pride. As the reality of the cold steel handcuffs clicked into place around her son's wrists, the paralysis that had gripped Brenda suddenly shattered. She let out a guttural, high-pitched wail that sounded more like a wounded animal than a wealthy suburban matriarch. She lunged forward, her expensive cashmere coat catching the edge of the coffee table as she threw herself between the two heavily built police officers and her son. "You cannot take him," she screamed, grabbing the heavy fabric of the lead detective's jacket with both hands. "He is a good man. He is a respected manager. You are making a terrible mistake. She is the crazy one. She set him up. She is a manipulative liar who just wants to ruin his career. Let him go right now." The lead detective did not even flinch. He planted his feet firmly on the hardwood floor, maintaining absolute professional composure as he gently but forcefully pried Brenda's manicured fingers off his uniform. "Ma'am, I am going to give you exactly one warning," he stated, his voice booming with an unyielding authority that filled the room. "Step away from the suspect right now. If you lay your hands on me or my officers again, I will immediately arrest you for assaulting a police officer and obstructing an active federal investigation. Put your hands at your sides and step back." Brenda stumbled backward, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. She looked at Greg, expecting him to put on a brave face to reassure her that their high-priced lawyers would fix everything. She expected the confident, arrogant boy she had raised to take control of the situation and demand respect. But Greg was not looking at her with love or gratitude. He was staring at the officers, his eyes wild with the specific, terrifying realization that he was about to trade his tailored navy suits for a concrete cell. He knew the financial evidence was sitting right there on the table. He knew he was facing mandatory minimum sentencing for federal wire fraud. He knew his life as a free man was effectively over. And in that moment of pure selfish desperation, Greg did the only thing a true narcissist knows how to do when cornered. He looked for a scapegoat. "It was her idea," Greg suddenly shouted, his voice cracking loudly as he twisted his neck to look at the detective. The entire room went completely dead. Keisha stopped sipping her coffee. The uniformed officers exchanged a quick professional glance. I sat perfectly still in my armchair watching the ultimate implosion of their toxic alliance. "I did not want to do it," Greg continued, frantically struggling against the officer's grip. "I just wanted a simple divorce. She is the one who told me to forge the loan documents. She said it was the only way to protect my assets from Natalie. She set up the trust account. She orchestrated the whole thing. She told me exactly which papers to sign and how to move the cash." Brenda looked as though she had been struck by lightning. The blood instantly drained from her face, leaving her pale and violently trembling. "Greg, what are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the harsh Chicago wind blowing against the plastic window tarp. "I did this for you. I was trying to protect you. I did not ask you to ruin my life," Greg screamed back at his own mother, entirely consumed by his blind panic. You told me to leave Leo at the house. You said you would come check on him so I could go to Paris. You said it would be fine. You promised you would call Child Protective Services to frame Natalie. Tell them. Tell the police it was your plan. I am not going to federal prison because of your stupid ideas. He was giving the police a full unprompted verbal confession to conspiracy fraud and child endangerment, all while actively attempting to throw the woman who had worshipped him his entire life directly under the bus. He was willing to watch his own mother die in a federal penitentiary if it meant he could shave a few months off his own sentence. The lead detective pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket, his expression completely neutral. Well, Gregory, we certainly appreciate the voluntary confession, the detective noted dryly, jotting down a few quick lines. And do not worry. We already have the wire transfer logs proving she accepted the stolen funds. We will make sure the federal prosecutor knows exactly how cooperative you are being today. Brenda let out a ragged, suffocating sob. The golden child she had protected, enabled, and committed grand larceny for had just sold her out without a second's hesitation. Her knees finally gave out. She collapsed onto the ruined living room rug, burying her face in her hands as she wept hysterically. She was completely destroyed by the monster she had created. The chaotic scene in my living room was suddenly interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps stomping rapidly up the front walkway. The damaged oak door was pushed open once again. It was Greg's lawyer. He had stormed out just minutes earlier, desperate to distance himself from the exploding financial fraud, but he had not made it very far. The 3 police cruisers that had arrived to arrest Greg were parked diagonally across the driveway, completely boxing in the lawyer's expensive luxury sedan. Trapped, freezing, and panicking, the attorney had marched back inside, likely hoping to control the narrative before the situation destroyed his firm completely. He stepped into the entryway, his eyes immediately locking onto Greg, who was now standing with his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. The sight of his client in federal custody seemed to trigger a desperate, deeply ingrained legal reflex. The lawyer puffed out his chest, gripped his leather briefcase, and marched toward the center of the room, attempting to project an authority he no longer possessed. "Officers, there has been a massive misunderstanding here," the lawyer announced, his voice tight and overly loud. "I am the legal counsel for this man. This is a civil domestic dispute regarding a contentious divorce. You have absolutely no right to enter this property and place my client in handcuffs without a warrant. I demand that you release him immediately and step outside." The lead detective slowly turned his head, looking the lawyer up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated boredom. The detective did not reach for his keys. He did not step back. "Counselor, your client just gave us a voluntary verbal confession to felony child endangerment and conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud," the detective replied smoothly. He also implicated his mother, who is currently crying on the floor, in a money laundering scheme. "I suggest you step back and let us do our job unless you want to be charged with interfering in an active federal investigation." The lawyer swallowed hard, his professional confidence visibly cracking. He looked at Greg, silently pleading for an explanation, but Greg simply stared at the floor, completely defeated. The attorney opened his mouth, prepared to launch into another aggressive legal defense to save his own skin. I did not let him speak. I stood up from my armchair, picked up the thick black binder from the coffee table, and flipped it open to the final tab. Keisha had verbally warned him about the affair earlier, but he clearly thought it was just a baseless accusation from an angry sister-in-law. He needed to see the physical proof. I reached into the protective sleeve and pulled out the high-definition color-printed screenshots Keisha and I had compiled the night before. I walked directly up to the lawyer, stopping just inches away from his expensive pinstripe suit, and shoved the photographs directly into his chest. He reflexively brought his hands up to grab them. "Take a very close look at those pictures," I commanded, my voice cold and absolute. "That is your client Greg, sitting in a VIP hospitality suite at a soccer stadium in Paris. And the woman leaning against his shoulder drinking expensive champagne paid for with stolen federal loan funds is your senior paralegal, Nicole Davis." The lawyer's eyes darted down to the glossy paper. I watched the blood completely drain from his face. His jaw went slack and a bead of cold sweat formed on his temple. The reality of the photographs hit him like a physical blow. It was undeniable time-stamped photographic evidence of a massive ethical breach. "You walked into my house today expecting to bully me into signing away my home," I continued, my words hitting him like rapid fire. "You thought you were representing a wealthy client. What you are actually doing is representing a federal criminal. And worse, your firm accepted a retainer fee paid entirely with money obtained through wire fraud. Under federal law, your law firm is now in possession of stolen funds." The lawyer began to shake. He looked from the photographs to me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. But I did not stop there. I stepped even closer, lowering my voice, so only he could hear the final nail being driven into his coffin. When I was sitting at the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office yesterday afternoon, I also had my laptop with me. While the federal agents were copying the fraud documents, I drafted a comprehensive 20-page grievance to the State Bar Association. I attached these exact photographs. I detailed your paralegal's romantic involvement with your client during active litigation. I detailed the fraudulent source of your retainer fee. I hit submit at exactly 2 o'clock yesterday. Your firm is officially under investigation for extreme conflict of interest and complicity in financial fraud. The lawyer dropped the photographs onto the floor, as if they were literally burning his hands. His entire career, his reputation, and his freedom were flashing before his eyes. He looked at Greg, his expression twisting into absolute disgust and terror. "I do not represent this man," the lawyer suddenly shouted, backing away from Greg and waving his hands frantically at the police officers. "I have no affiliation with him. I was lied to. I am formally withdrawing." He did not wait for the detective to respond. He spun around, clutching his briefcase to his chest, and sprinted toward the door. Because his car was hopelessly blocked in the driveway by the police cruisers, he did not even try to start the engine. He burst through the broken front door, hit the freezing concrete walkway, and literally started running down the street on foot. He abandoned his vehicle, abandoned his client, and fled the scene like a terrified child. Greg watched his absolute last line of defense sprint down the cold Chicago street, disappearing around the corner. The silence in the living room returned heavier and more final than before. There were no more tricks. There were no more allies. The game was entirely over. The lead detective turned away from the open doorway and offered a sharp, definitive nod to the two uniformed officers. It was time to go. They tightened their grip on Greg's arms, pulling him roughly toward the entryway. For a brief, pathetic second, Greg tried to dig his expensive Italian leather shoes into the hardwood floor. He twisted his neck, looking back at me, with eyes wide and pleading. "Natalie, please!" he begged, his voice cracking into a high pitch of absolute desperation. "You cannot let them do this. Think about Leo. He is just a little boy. He needs his father. Do not take his father away from him over a mistake." I stood up from the armchair, my posture rigid and my expression completely devoid of mercy. "Leo needed his father on Thursday night. Greg," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the freezing room, "when he was crying in the dark, when he was shivering on the floor. Today, my son does not need a father. He just needs you gone." The officers did not give him another second to plead. They yanked him forward. As they dragged him through the entryway, his foot caught the heavy canvas duffel bag I had packed with his belongings. He stumbled awkwardly, his knees slamming hard against the floorboards. The cheap plastic duty-free bag he had brought from the airport was crushed beneath the heavy tactical boot of the officer on his right. The miniature metal Eiffel Tower snapped in half, scraping across the wood. They hoisted him back to his feet without a word of comfort and shoved him through the splintered doorframe into the biting Chicago winter air. I followed them to the threshold, standing safely inside the ruined doorway, to watch the final destruction of his public facade. Greg had spent 5 years meticulously cultivating his image in our affluent suburban neighborhood. He wanted everyone to view him as the ultimate successful family man, the guy with the perfect lawn, the luxury car, and the flawless life. He thrived on the envy of others. But as the officers marched him down the concrete walkway, that carefully crafted illusion was violently shredded in broad daylight. It was 10:15 on a Saturday morning. The flashing red and blue lights of three heavily marked police cruisers parked diagonally across our driveway had drawn a massive audience. The neighbors who had been awakened by the sound of shattering glass and police sirens on Thursday night were not going to miss the grand finale. Dozens of people were standing on their frost-covered lawns and crowding the sidewalks. They were wearing thick winter coats, holding steaming travel mugs of coffee, and pointing their smartphones directly at my husband. The camera lenses captured every single humiliating second. Greg immediately tried to duck his head, desperately attempting to hide his face from the high-definition recording devices. But the officers kept a firm grip on his biceps, forcing him to walk completely upright. Right at the edge of our property line stood Mrs. Gable, the neighborhood association president, and the exact woman who had called emergency services 2 nights prior. She was holding her phone up high, narrating the scene loudly to a live audience on the community social media page. "That is him," she announced, her voice carrying sharply in the cold air. "That is the man who locked his baby in a freezing house to go on vacation. The police are finally taking him away." Greg squeezed his eyes shut, his face burning a deep, humiliated crimson. "Turn the cameras off," he shouted blindly, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "This is illegal. You cannot film me." Nobody lowered their phones. Instead, the humiliation deepened. Standing right next to Mrs. Gable was a man named David. David lived 3 houses down, but more importantly, he worked as a senior compliance officer at the exact same corporate sales firm that employed Greg. They shared the same regional director. They attended the same company retreats. Greg opened his eyes and saw David watching him. The absolute horror of professional ruin washed over Greg's face. "David, please," Greg pleaded, struggling against the handcuffs. "It is a massive misunderstanding. Do not tell the regional director. Do not let this get to human resources. I can explain everything on Monday." David did not look sympathetic. He looked at Greg with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are not coming into the office on Monday, Greg," David replied loudly, ensuring everyone heard him. "I already sent the Thursday night police report to the corporate ethics board. Our company does not employ felons who abandon their children. You are completely finished." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. In less than a minute, Greg had lost his family, his home, and now his entire professional career broadcast live to the very people he had spent years trying to impress. The officers reached the lead police cruiser. One of them opened the heavy rear door, placed a firm hand on the top of Greg's perfectly styled hair, and forced his head down. They shoved him roughly into the hard, molded plastic back seat of the patrol car. The officer slammed the heavy door shut. The loud metallic clunk echoed through the quiet suburban street, signaling the absolute terrifying finality of his lost freedom. Through the reinforced glass window, I could see Greg slump forward against the security grate, his shoulders shaking as the reality of his new life finally broke him. The cruiser reversed out of the driveway, the sirens briefly wailing as it turned down the street, carrying my husband away to a federal holding cell. I watched the police cruiser disappear around the corner of our street, the flashing red and blue lights fading into the gray morning. The crowd of neighbors lingering on the frost-covered lawns began to disperse, talking in hushed, scandalized whispers. I turned away from the cold street and walked back into the entryway, stepping over the cheap plastic souvenirs Greg had dropped. The harsh winter wind blew through the splintered doorframe, carrying the bitter chill of reality directly into the living room. I stood at the edge of the ruined rug and looked at Brenda. My mother-in-law was still sitting on the floor where she had collapsed. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her expensive cashmere coat was wrinkled and covered in dust from the overturned furniture. She was hyperventilating, taking short, jagged breaths, as she stared blankly at the spot where her son had been standing just minutes ago. The golden child she had protected and enabled her entire life had not hesitated to trade her freedom for a chance to save himself. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the rustle of the heavy plastic tarp taped over the kitchen window and Brenda's ragged sobbing. Keisha walked quietly from the kitchen island, joining me at the edge of the living room. We stood shoulder to shoulder, two women who had been chronically underestimated, watching the absolute destruction of the woman who had tormented us both. Brenda slowly raised her head. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. When she looked at me, her eyes were no longer filled with venom or aristocratic superiority. They were filled with a desperate, pathetic pleading. "Natalie," she gasped, pressing her trembling hand against her chest. "Natalie, you have to help me. You know I did not plan this. You know Greg has always been headstrong. He manipulated me. He told me it was just a temporary transfer to protect his savings. I am an old woman. I cannot go to federal prison. Please tell the investigators I had nothing to do with this. We are family. We can fix this together." The sheer audacity of her plea was staggering. Less than 20 minutes ago, she was gloating about having the liquid cash to buy me out of my own home. She had threatened to take my son. She had called me an unfit mother. And now she was begging me to save her from the very trap she had gleefully helped set. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy. I crossed my arms over my chest and looked down at her with absolute, unwavering coldness. "We are not family, Brenda," I said, my voice sharp and flat. "You made sure of that the second you read a text message saying your 4-year-old grandson was locked alone in a freezing house, and you chose to do absolutely nothing. You are not a victim. You knew exactly what you were doing when you accepted $106,000 in stolen funds. You did not care if I ended up homeless and bankrupt, as long as your precious son got exactly what he wanted." Brenda squeezed her eyes shut, letting out another pathetic wail. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I have lost everything. My trust account is frozen. My son is gone." "You did not lose it, Brenda," I corrected her. "You threw it away, and now you are going to leave my house." I lifted my left wrist and looked at my watch. The silver hands clicked loudly against the quiet backdrop of the room. "It is 10:22, I announced, dropping my arm and locking my eyes onto her tear-stained face. "I am giving you exactly 60 seconds to pick yourself off my floor walk, out that broken front door, and get off my property. If you are still standing in my driveway when the minute is up, I am calling the police department back here to arrest you for criminal trespassing." Brenda stared at me, her mouth hanging open in shock. "You cannot be serious." 50 seconds, Keisha chimed in cheerfully from my right, checking her own smartphone screen. "And considering the neighbors are still standing outside gossiping about your son, I highly doubt you want to be dragged out of here in handcuffs right in front of them." That specific threat finally broke through her paralysis. The fear of public humiliation was the only thing Brenda cared about more than money. She scrambled frantically to her feet, her expensive leather boots slipping awkwardly against the hardwood floor. She grabbed her designer handbag from the armchair, her hands shaking violently as she pulled her cashmere coat tight around her shoulders. She did not say another word. She could not look me in the eye. She stumbled past us, practically running toward the entryway. She stepped over her son's packed canvas duffel bag, her heels clicking rapidly against the floorboards. She pushed past the splintered door and practically sprinted down the walkway toward her luxury sedan. She did not look back. She threw herself into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped out of the driveway so fast her tires squealed against the cold pavement. I watched her car disappear down the street, taking the last remnants of the toxic family with it. I turned to Keisha and let out a long, shuddering breath. The house was a disaster, the bank accounts were a mess, and the front door was destroyed. But as I stood in the quiet living room, listening to the faint sound of the animated movie still playing in the back room for Leo, I felt a massive, incredible weight lift completely off my shoulders. We had won. 6 months had passed since the cold November morning when the police cruisers pulled out of my driveway. The harsh Chicago winter had finally melted into a bright, optimistic spring. But inside the federal courthouse downtown, the atmosphere remained incredibly cold and sterile. I sat in the second row of the heavy wooden gallery benches, wearing a sharp, dark gray business suit. Keisha was sitting right beside me, her arms crossed, her expression stoic and unreadable. We were not there to fight. The fight had ended months ago. We were simply there to witness the final accounting. The heavy side door of the courtroom opened and a United States Marshal escorted the defendant into the room. It was Greg. The physical transformation was absolutely staggering. There were no tailored navy suits, there were no expensive Italian leather shoes, there was no arrogant, confident smile. My ex-husband was wearing a standard-issue bright orange correctional facility jumpsuit. His wrists were shackled in heavy steel chains attached to a thick leather belt around his waist. He looked 10 years older. His perfect hair was buzzed incredibly short, and his face was pale and gaunt. He did not look like a high-powered corporate sales manager. He looked exactly like what he was, a defeated, convicted felon. He shuffled toward the defense table, his head hung low, refusing to look back at the gallery. He did not have a high-priced private attorney standing next to him today. After his previous lawyer fled my house and the State Bar Association launched an aggressive ethics investigation into the firm, Greg was forced to rely on an overworked public defender. The federal judge, an older man with absolutely no patience for white-collar criminals, called the court to order. Because Keisha and I had handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a completely indexed, airtight binder of financial evidence, there was no lengthy, dramatic trial. Greg had no viable defense. He had accepted a comprehensive plea agreement to avoid spending the next 20 years behind bars. The federal prosecutor read the finalized charges into the official record: wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, felony child endangerment. When the judge asked for his official plea, Greg leaned awkwardly toward the small microphone on the table. His voice, which used to boom with false authority, was now nothing more than a pathetic broken whisper. "Guilty, Your Honor," he croaked. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down, finalizing his ruin. Greg was formally sentenced to 36 months in a federal penitentiary, followed by 5 years of heavily monitored probation. But the judge was not finished. He turned immediately to the matter of financial restitution. Because the $150,000 fraudulent loan had to be repaid to the bank, the court ordered the immediate liquidation of Greg's entire corporate retirement portfolio. Every single dollar he had saved for his future was seized by the federal government. The judge then formally severed his legal claim to our marital assets. I was awarded full, unencumbered ownership of the house. The federal foreclosure was officially reversed, wiping the fraudulent debt completely clean from my name. The federal sentencing was simply the final nail in the coffin. The family court judge had already ruled on our divorce 3 weeks prior. Based on the child endangerment conviction and the horrific security camera footage, Greg was permanently stripped of his parental rights. I was granted 100% sole physical and legal custody of Leo. Greg was not granted weekend visitations. He was not granted supervised visits. He was permanently, legally removed from my son's life. As the marshals led Greg away to begin his prison sentence, I thought about the one person who was noticeably absent from the courtroom today: Brenda. She had managed to avoid a federal prison sentence herself, but only because she had aggressively cooperated with the prosecution, officially turning state's evidence against her own son. She traded his freedom for a plea deal that kept her out of a jail cell, but she did not escape punishment. The federal government had permanently seized her $106,000 trust account to cover massive legal fines and restitution penalties. Without that financial safety net, her carefully constructed aristocratic life completely collapsed. Her massive suburban house went into foreclosure. Derek and Keisha officially cut all contact with her, refusing to let her toxic presence anywhere near their family. Brenda was now living entirely alone in a cramped, poorly lit studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. She had no money, no golden child, and no family left to manipulate. She spent her days entirely alienated, sitting in a tiny room surrounded by the permanent wreckage of her own arrogance. I stood up from the wooden bench, smoothing the front of my jacket. Keisha gave my shoulder a firm, supportive squeeze. We walked out of the courtroom together, pushing through the heavy double doors into the bright sunlit hallway. The legal battle was officially over. The smell of roasting hickory wood and sweet barbecue sauce drifted lazily through the warm summer air. I stood on the back patio of my home, the same house that Greg and Brenda had tried so desperately to steal from me, and took a deep, unrestricted breath. The shattered kitchen window had been replaced months ago. The splintered oak front door had been upgraded to a solid steel security frame, and the heavy toxic energy that used to suffocate these walls was entirely gone. It was a perfect Sunday afternoon in late July, and for the first time in my adult life, my home truly felt like a sanctuary. I picked up a pair of silver tongs and expertly flipped a row of thick marinated steaks sizzling on the grill. The loud, joyous sound of a child's laughter echoed from the center of the expansive green lawn. I looked over my shoulder and smiled. Leo, now almost 5 years old, was running at full speed through the oscillating spray of a bright yellow lawn sprinkler, his bare feet slapping against the wet grass. He was completely carefree, completely safe, and entirely happy. He did not ask about his father anymore. The nightmares he experienced in the weeks following that freezing Thursday night had slowly faded away, replaced by the deep, unwavering certainty that his mother would never let him be abandoned in the dark again. "I got you," a voice yelled playfully. Keisha lunged from the edge of the patio, playfully grabbing Leo's waist and spinning him around in the air before setting him down near the edge of the water. He shrieked with delight and immediately darted back into the sprinkler. Keisha walked over to the grill, shaking the water droplets from her arms, and grabbed 2 ice-cold bottles of sparkling water from the cooler. She cracked the caps open and handed one to me. She was still working long shifts at the hospital trauma center, and she had just finalized the adoption paperwork for a rescue dog she had found abandoned near the clinic. Her husband Derek had initially struggled to process the sheer magnitude of his mother's and brother's crimes, but with Keisha's unwavering support, he had chosen to distance himself from the toxic legacy of his family and focus entirely on building a healthy future. Keisha clinked her glass bottle against mine. To taking out the trash, she said, her dark eyes sparkling with a fierce, unapologetic joy. "And to the women who know exactly how to clean up a mess." "To strong women," I replied, taking a long, refreshing sip. "And to forensic accounting." We both laughed, a genuine, easy sound that felt incredibly light. It was astonishing to reflect on how drastically my reality had shifted in just 6 months. When I first discovered Greg's betrayal, I thought my life was over. I thought the financial ruin and the emotional devastation would completely break me. I had spent years walking on eggshells trying to appease a narcissistic husband and a cruel mother-in-law, constantly shrinking myself to make them comfortable. I had accepted their disrespect because I falsely believed it was the price of keeping my family together. But the moment Greg locked that door, he unintentionally handed me the keys to my own freedom. By pushing me to the absolute edge of survival, he forced me to remember exactly who I was. I was not a weak, submissive wife. I was a brilliant, capable woman who could dismantle a federal fraud scheme before breakfast. I did not need a man to provide for me, and I certainly did not need a toxic family to validate my worth. I turned back to the grill, checking the temperature of the steaks. My career was thriving. Without the constant draining emotional anchor of Greg's manufactured crises, my focus and productivity had skyrocketed. My accounting firm had recently promoted me to senior partner, recognizing the sharp analytical skills and decisive leadership I had proven both inside and outside the office. My credit score was fully restored, the house was completely paid off using the seized funds from Greg's retirement account, and Leo's college fund was securely established. I had built an impenetrable fortress of stability and peace. "Mommy, look at me!" Leo shouted, pulling me from my thoughts. He was standing near the edge of the garden, holding up a small, brightly colored butterfly that had briefly landed on his outstretched finger. His face was glowing with pure, unadulterated wonder. "I see you, baby," I called back, my heart swelling with a profound, overwhelming love. "It is beautiful." I leaned against the brick edge of the patio, watching my son run across the grass, feeling the warm summer sun on my face. There were no more secrets in this house. There were no more lies, no more hidden bank accounts, and no more screaming matches. The people who had tried to destroy us were locked away in tiny, miserable boxes of their own making, while we were standing in the light completely free. Sometimes the universe does not gently nudge you toward the life you are meant to live. Sometimes it shatters your windows and forces you to fight your way out of the dark. But if you have the courage to stand your ground and fight back with everything you have, you will find that the life waiting for you on the other side is sweeter and more beautiful than you ever imagined. I took another sip of my drink, smiled at Keisha, and watched my son play in the sun. We had survived the storm, and the rest of our lives was just beginning. The harrowing story of Natalie's betrayal teaches a profound lesson about the incredible power of emotional control and strategic silence in the face of absolute devastation. When confronted with a nightmare, a husband who abandoned their 4-year-old child and orchestrated a malicious financial attack, most people would naturally surrender to their rage. They would scream, send furious text messages, or confront the betrayer instantly. However, Natalie's ultimate triumph demonstrates that giving into immediate emotional outbursts often relinquishes your power to the very people trying to destroy you. Instead of reacting with chaotic anger, Natalie chose the terrifying but effective weapon of silence. She compartmentalized her heartbreak, activated her professional skills, and methodically dismantled her husband's fraudulent empire piece by piece. By staying exceptionally calm, she gathered undeniable financial evidence, secured her child's safety, and engaged the legal system before her husband even knew she was aware of his crimes. Her journey reveals that true strength isn't always loud, violent, or dramatic. Sometimes it is cold, calculating, and impeccably organized. We will all face moments of betrayal, unfairness, or profound injustice in our lives, though hopefully never to this extreme magnitude. When those dark moments strike, our first biological instinct will always be to lash out, to defend ourselves loudly, and to demand immediate answers. Yet this narrative reminds us that our greatest defense mechanism is a clear, focused mind. When you pause to assess the situation and build a factual foundation, you permanently strip toxic individuals of their ability to gaslight or manipulate you. You reclaim your life and your narrative not through exhausting screaming matches, but through undeniable truth and resolute action. If you are currently facing a toxic situation, take a deep breath. Gather your facts in silence and refuse to let them steal your peace.